We will start in about 10 minutes, so please feel free to enjoy whatever is in front of you, some eats, some drinks, before we get started. So feel free and feel relaxed. Thank you.
Begin with the program. We are already 17 minutes delayed. Old people they are not late but delayed, it's said. Please, let's get seated so we can begin with our program. And those online, apologies as well. We know you are there. And apologies for the 17 and a half delay. We are going to start now.
Good evening. Good evening to you all, esteemed guests, honored ladies and gentlemen. So tonight we seem to have quite many high-level dignitaries, and I'm tempted to use the normal phrase to say all protocol observed, but I might risk my job, so I will have to acknowledge a few people by name. First and foremost, it is a privilege to welcome the Principal and Vice Chancellor of the Northwest University, Professor Mzwanzi Bismarck Jobeka, our distinguished guest and speaker tonight, Professor Sir Hilary Beckles, members of the executive and senior management of the Northwest University, members of the diplomatic corps, and special mention and recognition of the Jamaican High Commissioner to South Africa, Honorable Joanne Thomas Edwards. And I'm told we have Mr. F.E. July, Ambassador of Guyana, who is also here with us. The Speaker of the Northwest Provincial Legislature, I think he will come later, but I know we have the Mayor of the city of Matlosana, Councillor Fikile Mahlope, and the CEO, Northwest Cricket, Mr. Ismail Minty. All senior government officials who are present, we recognize you, esteemed colleagues, honored guests, staff, students. A very warm welcome to you all. I really must thank all of you for making time and for braving the call to come together in pursuit of knowledge and dialogue this evening. I'm particularly proud and excited to see some of our students here. And I think it's a good sign that our students are also keen on public lectures such as these. I'm Professor Dumi Moyo, the Executive Dean of the Faculty of Humanities, and I will be guiding us through tonight's proceedings. I'm very excited tonight because we are hosting this public lecture in collaboration with the Office of the Vice Chancellor. This lecture is a second installment in a series of lectures that we have started in the Faculty of Humanities, which we initiated precisely to provide a platform for our honorary doctorate recipients on the cusp of their recognition to engage with our academic community and our invited guests to share insights and challenge us to think differently on a topic of their choice. The first lecture, for those that would remember, featured a prominent historian, Professor Toyin Falola from the University of Texas at Austin, who spoke on humanities education for African futures, reimagining scholarship, creativity, and knowledge production in a changing world. And he emphasized the importance of indigenous knowledge systems, or what he termed ancestral intelligence, especially in the current discourse on artificial intelligence, urging us to recognize our African roots as a resource of future potential. Tonight's distinguished speaker, Professor Sir Hilary Beckos, will be formally welcomed by our Vice Chancellor, Professor Chobeka. But I want to say upfront that the significance of tonight's lecture extends beyond the focus on the transatlantic slave trade and the attendant questions of reparations, which are at the heart of Professor Beckos' work. It's a call to forge deeper connections between Africa and its wider diaspora, including our Caribbean brothers and sisters, and to seek common solutions to shared struggles. As many of you would be aware, the African Union recognizes the African diaspora as its sixth region since 2003, in recognition of the contribution of the African diaspora to Africa's development and future. We are privileged tonight to have Ambassador Edwards, who will make some brief remarks after the question and answer session on the Caribbean community and Africa collaboration. This evening, we have an opportunity to reflect on how discourses that often seem disparate on social injustice across continents are actually threads in the same fabric. We are also able to reflect on the important role of humanities scholarship, of intellectuals in bringing to the fore some of society's most difficult and uncomfortable questions. As renowned Palestinian scholar Edward Said pointed out, the intellectual's role generally is to challenge and defeat both the imposed silence and the normalized quiet of unseen power, wherever and whenever possible, to question dominant narratives, close quote. This is exactly the kind of intellectual courage and critical engagement that characterizes Professor Beckos' work, and I very much look forward to his insights tonight. Before I invite Professor Chobeka to come to the podium, I would like to highlight that it is through his visionary leadership and the relentless effort to position the Northwest University within global discourses, particularly through our internationalization strategy, that we are here tonight. 2 years ago, Professor Chobeka led a multi-faculty delegation to the University of the West Indies, one of the first such internationalization missions, resulting in a milestone memorandum of understanding and a host of collaborative initiatives. So tonight's lecture and the upcoming honorary degree award tomorrow are living testaments of the fruits of that transformative visit. With that, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming our Vice Chancellor, Professor Chobeka, to the stage.
Thank you very much, Professor Dumi, for the kind words. We are running behind schedule, so I will straight away plow in to the business of the day. Let me greet the members of the university management and those in the senior management of the university, the diplomatic corps that is present today, both our ambassadors from Jamaica and Guyana. That would be the Honorable John Thomas Edwards and the Honorable F.E. July from Jamaica and Guyana, respectively. The Speaker of the Provincial Legislature, our own freshly minted PhD alumnus, Dr. Desbo Mohono, staff and student, senior government officials that are here, the Honorable Mayor from KK Kaunda District. Most significantly, our distinguished guest and speaker, Professor Sir Hilary Beckles. On behalf of the Northwest University Council and our executive management and Senate, it is an honor to welcome you at this seminal occasion. A public lecture that, in my view, is of deep intellectual, ethical, and geopolitical significance. It engages the frontiers of academic discourse, and it also touches on the historical imperatives of the South African polity, the Caribbean diaspora, the broader African continent, and indeed the global community. This engagement stands as a clarion call to advance the enduring agenda for justice, human dignity, and the rectification of historical injustices through principled multilateral dialogues. I'm therefore very happy that we are afforded this invaluable opportunity to convene in such a dignified manner. Esteemed guests, colleagues, and student leaders, it is important for us to have these conversations. As Sir Hilary likes to call them, conversations about our history and its impact on the present and the future. It really gives me pleasure to welcome Professor Sir Hilary Beckles to Potchefstroom, to the Northwest Province, and to the African soil that is South Africa. An institution of ours which is firmly anchored in the pursuit of justice, social justice, scholarly distinction, and Pan-African solidarity. Professor Beckles has come to South Africa several times, and he is very familiar with our history and some of the problems we are currently facing at the moment. Professor Hilary, the conversation about our history and its relationship with the present, Prof. Hilary, the conversation about our history and its relationship with the present and the future is clear to us as South Africans. As you are aware, the preamble of our Constitution deals directly with the issues related to your topic and our transformation journey as a people. It states in short, and I quote, "We, the people of South Africa, recognize the injustices of our past," close quote, and it goes on to mention other crucial issues, including heal divisions of the past and establish a society based on democratic values, social justice, and fundamental human rights, close quote. Therefore, the issue of redress is a global conversation that we are very much part of as a country, particularly considering our history. As you would know, Prof, from your encounters with the European leaders, it is not easy to accept the need for redress or reparatory justice. The people may accept that slavery or oppression was deplorable and a crime, but they never apologize or agree to a program of redress. This evening lecture, titled "From Durban to Accra, Rise of Global Reparations Movement," eloquently captures the seismic shifts currently underway in the architecture of global governance. What were once dismissed as moral pleas are now asserting rightful judicial status, demanding legislative traction and enforceable redress. The era of rhetorical sympathy without structural accountability is rightly drawing to a close. Many of you may be aware that the African Union's 2025 theme is justice for Africans and people of African descent through reparations. The African Union chose this theme because they believe that this initiative underscores the commitment to addressing historical injustices, including transatlantic slave trade, colonialism, apartheid, and genocide. It builds on decades of advocacy and collaboration, aiming to foster unity and establish mechanisms of reparatory justice on a global scale, close quote. It is within this political, legal, and historical context that today's engagement finds its substantive legitimacy and geopolitical salience. This is a moment of transitional reckoning where the aspirations of the past intersect with the imperatives of the future, where justice is no longer aspirational, but it is actionable. In his recent address to the United Nations, Sir Hillary reminded the world that, quote, reparation is not a cry for handouts. It is a legitimate call for development justice, for truth-telling, and for healing. It is a demand that the arc of history bend not only toward justice, but also toward dignity, close quote. Professor Hillary has dedicated himself to serve society in many ways, and his contributions deserve recognition. As they say in South Africa, we must give him his flowers. Tomorrow, the Northwest University will confer upon Prof. Sir Hillary Beckles an honorary doctorate, our highest academic honor, for his sterling contribution to the international struggle for reparatory justice and global decoloniality. This conferment is a solemn institutional recognition of Sir Hillary's enduring labor in both academy and the corridors of global diplomacy. It is, in effect, a reaffirmation of the unity between intellectual rigor and a social struggle. Esteemed guests and colleagues, recognizing the shared values, experiences, and structural configuration between our university and the University of the West Indies, we signed, as Professor Dumi mentioned, a memorandum of understanding in 2024. We have a lot in common that can benefit our staff and students. As the university, we remain committed to anchoring our scholarship in the service of society. We see ourselves not just spectators or bystanders to this historical tide, but as active shapers of a future in which memory, justice, and dignity coexist in equilibrium. Let me then, with humility and great appreciation, officially open this public lecture. May tonight's engagements stimulate the conscience and inspire new coalitions of moral courage and intellectual tenacity. It is an honor and privilege for us to host Professor Sir Hillary Beckles here at our Potchefstroom campus. Professor Hillary Beckles is the Vice Chancellor of the University of the West Indies. He is a distinguished academic, international thought leader, United Nations Committee official, and global public activist in the field of social justice and minority empowerment. He is the chairman of the Caribbean Community Reparations Commission, so-called referred to as CARICOM. He is also the director of Sagicor Financial Corporation, the largest financial company in the Caribbean region, and the chairman of the Caribbean Examinations Council. He has also served as the advisor to the United Nations World Culture Report and advisor to the Secretary General of the United Nations on Sustainable Development. He is the past vice president of the International Task Force for the UNESCO Slave Route Project and a former consultant to UNESCO Cities for Peace Global Program. He has been appointed Chancellor or Chair of the United Nations University with effect from May 2025. You will all recall that the current Vice Chancellor of the United Nations University is none other than our own Professor Chiliji Marwala. The achievements of Professor Beckles are numerous and would take me the whole night to mention. But I know we all waiting to hear from him. Ladies and gentlemen, help me welcome our distinguished speaker, Professor Sir Hilary Beckles, to the stage.
It is much more than an honor to be here at Northwest in South Africa. It is a joy. It's a joy and a pleasure. And I wish to thank our Vice Chancellor, Tibika, for his very kind words and his welcome, and all of his colleagues and officials of his executive management team and other members of faculty, students. I would wish also to recognize Her Excellency, my own ambassador in Jamaica, Ambassador Her Excellency Joan Edwards, and my colleague, also Ambassador from the Republic of Guyana. They are here to make sure I behave myself. I wouldn't wish them to send home a report that somehow I let the side down. So I thank them for being here. I thank all of you, colleagues and friends, for taking the time to come to participate in this conversation. I do not know how it all started, but a few years ago I was interviewed by the BBC, and the interviewer might have thought that she was going to put me on the back foot at the outset of that interview, and she asked me, "Professor, when were you radicalized?" I reflected upon it and I said, I think I was about 5 years old when I was radicalized. And she asked, by whom? I said, well, my first week in primary school, I realized that some of us were barefooted. I was one of those barefooted children. But other children with a different complexion to myself were wearing shoes. And I asked my grandmother, who was raising me, why is it I don't have any shoes? And my grandmother, her usual Christian evangelical humor, she was our village preacher, she said, because they are uncomfortable. Well, you know, it all began in simple ways. And then later on, when I entered high school, I recall my first history class, and our history teacher showed us a picture of Toussaint Louverture, a black man on a horse with a sword in his hand, and explained to us that this is the man who freed who freed the enslaved people, Toussaint Louverture of Haiti. And that image stuck with me, and these were like milestones along the way. And at the age of 17, I'm going off to university, and I chose to study philosophy because I wanted to be a philosopher. That was how I was socialized. The issues of injustice, inequality, rage and anger and violence, and all of these inhumane actions, I had an interest in understanding how and why. And so I thought the best thing to do was to study philosophy, to understand why it is that humanity could be so cruel to itself. So yes, I went off to the University of Hull in the UK because I was a part of that generation of West Indians who went to England after the war. My parents went looking for work to feed their children. And they went off to England, and within the next decade, they brought their kids over from the Caribbean to England. So one moment I was in Barbados, and the next moment I was in Birmingham City. But we had to navigate, and I tried to navigate the inner city culture of Britain and survive the schooling system. I was 13 years old when I went to the UK, and was like all the migrant kids. We were just thrown into the ghetto schools. You know, these migrants, they put you in the worst schools they had available, but somehow you survive. And off I went to be a philosopher. I came home after my first term, and my father looked at me and he says, "Listen to me. It's just time you wake up. What is a working class black guy going to do with a degree in philosophy? Get real. Go and do something that will give you a job. Philosophy will give you unemployment." So, parental pressure, I went back to school and I went through the faculties looking for a program. And I wanted a program that would tell me something about what was then classified as the underdeveloped world. I wanted something with economics to understand. I wanted something with history so I could know how all of this started. And I found the right program, economic history. And that was the program I did. I had one foot in the economics faculty and the other foot in the history faculty. So yes, it all evolved in that way. My connection to this country, of course, are very deep and very personal. Even before I was born, a member of my family lost his life in this country. One of my maternal cousins was working in the British Merchant Marine, and his ship docked in Cape Town, and he came off the ship looking for a place to drink a few beers, and This was 1950, 2 years after apartheid, but he probably did not get the memo that there was something called apartheid. So he came off the ship, went on land, as they could in those days, went to a bar, was drinking, was beat up by some white dudes who told him if he couldn't read the sign on the outside. They called the police came, they took him away, and he died in a police prison, in a police cell. So before I was born, the connection had started. That event generated one of the largest demonstrations ever in the history of Barbados. Over 10,000 people marched through the streets of Bridgetown demanding no apartheid, democracy, justice for all. I have the photographs of that demonstration, and the banners were very, very clear. And I have always treasured that image, because what it tells you is that you are just in the stream of an historic journey. There were things that happened before, and of course there were things that would happen in the future. And one of those things was, I think the first time I almost lost my life was outside of the South African embassy in the Strand in London, where as students we would all go to protest the apartheid world, the imprisonment of Mandela. And I had the pleasure of meeting Steve Biko. In those days, as a student, I used to go into Africa quite often, and met Steve. And my son carries the name Biko, so he reminds me of that connection. So off we went, trying to make the world a better place. One of the first engagements on this subject of reparatory justice was an invitation in Jamaica. I finished my PhD. I had examined the movement of labor across from Europe to the Americas. My study, ironically, was a study of white working class migration to America, because my professor said, okay, Hillary, everyone is studying black slavery. You study white slavery. So that's what I did. I did a study on the oppression of working class white people in the plantations. So I became known as the black guy with a female name studying white people. So I was the quintessential anomaly as a student and as a young academic. And my question was, as my research question was, the Europeans came to the Americas and built out these plantation systems, and their first cohort of labor was white labor. So they grabbed all the working class people out of England, out of the prisons, out of the vagrants on the streets, the unemployed poor. They grabbed over 50,000 poor white people, and they put them on the ships, and they sent them off to the Caribbean to work on the sugar plantations. They tried to enslave them, but could not. Those plantation owners would have enslaved anyone who they could to make the profits they wanted. They tried, but they couldn't. And the reason they couldn't was because the British government intervened. The British Parliament had a special debate on the question of white slavery in the Caribbean in 1659. And it was a special debate because the Speaker of the House made a statement, having received news of how the poor, landless white community was being treated. He made a statement, if we are enslaving our own people, then we are a nation most miserable. And went on to say that the history of the British people can be told is a history of the gradual freeing of the lower orders. And if we are to reverse that history by reverting to the enslavement of our own kind, then we are a people most miserable, and call for an absolute abolition of any form of undue exploitation of working class white people on the plantations, and to resolve this problem, to bring in the Africans who we must enslave. In that same parliamentary discussion, the British Parliament voted a substantial amount of money to establish England's first slave trading company, the Royal Company for Adventurers into Africa. And that company was given a remit to bring 4,000 enslaved Africans into the Caribbean on an annual basis to populate the plantations of Barbados, Jamaica, Antigua, and St. Kitts. So we know that it was a clear choice. Slavery was classified as a form of labor exclusively and explicitly for the African people, and critically, they were brought to the Caribbean to serve for life. The white workers were under contracts of indenture. Those who entered voluntarily into a contract served for 7 years. Those who were deported by the government for crimes or vagrancy were given a one-way ticket to return to England under pain of death. So the Africans were classified under law, first in Barbados, the first slave code. 1661, the first slave code, an act for the good governance of African slaves. And that act was very explicit. Africans are not humans, they are chattel, they are property, they are real estate with all of the attendant values of property. Meaning, you could buy it, sell it, mortgage it, you could use it as currency, as collateral in contracts. It carried all of the fundamental features of property, and it was intergenerational. The offspring of all African women took the status of their mother. So while the mother was an enslaved person, all her children were born into slavery. So that is how the system reproduced itself, and Barbados became the largest African community in all of America. Barbados was the place with the largest African population, the largest slave population, because this was where the sugar industry, the plantation sugar industry, was revolutionized, producing the richest white men in America in the middle of the 17th century. The remarkable feature about that is that for a small island of 166 square miles, to have on it 100,000 enslaved Africans is phenomenal. But that was where the transatlantic slave trade was first focused. I am a descendant of that Barbados enslaved population. And we know what it is to be a descendant of that, because I am a survivor not only of slavery, but of genocide. And the historians have presented the evidence quite clearly. The Europeans, the English, they brought 600,000 enslaved Africans to Barbados. Now I want you to imagine 600,000 people. At emancipation, 200 years later, there were only 83,000 remaining. How do you reduce 600,000 people over 200 years to 83,000? Clearly, the demographic evidence was that the management system was designed to destroy and not to sustain life. And that is why less than 20% of those who were brought over survive. So I'm a descendant of that 20% that has survived on the island. And this is why those of us in this reparatory justice movement, we have said that the island that was the home of chattel slavery, which made Barbados the most evil society ever created on God's earth, the most evil society ever created. Our task is now to create Barbados into the most free, the most joyous, and the happiest society the world has ever seen. Our project is to turn this history upon its head and show the creativity and the resolve of the human mind. My engagement in reparatory justice has been a part of all of this. My task has been to research it, present the evidentiary basis of the statements we make, provide advocacy around that information with a view to changing the world through the promotion of the principles I went in search of as a student, as a philosophy student at the age of 17. Very little has changed in my 50 years since then. Very little has changed. So we're on the... I have entitled the presentation from Durban to Accra. And I really should have added from Durban to Addis via Accra. Because in the first week of September, the global African world is meeting in Accra, a joint summit between the African Union and the CARICOM region to speak about changing the world in the next 50 years by integrating concepts such as reparatory justice, climate change, human insecurity, wars and terrorism upon innocent men, women, and children, how to interlock all of these discourses into a practical and viable theory of human development. My first time here in South Africa was in 2001 at the Durban conference, which was the United Nations first conference on reparatory justice. And it spoke of the affairs in the black world around that time. I was asked to lead the Barbados delegation to that conference. And I had the good fortune of sitting in the front row of an intergovernment plenary where we were seated alphabetically, and I was sandwiched between Arafat and Castro. And for the life of me, I don't know how I was able to speak, because Arafat had been leading the call for justice for the Palestinian people. Fidel Castro had declared the revolution as a way to bring justice to the poor. And I was in the middle of all of that. And it was an interesting time, because President Mbeki was in the chair of that plenary session. And my hope was to find a way to visit the great Nelson Mandela, and also to visit Reverend Aristide, who had been overthrown as the president of Haiti because he had the audacity to ask the French government to repair the reparations that the freed African people in Haiti were asked to pay. And you may recall that history. The Africans in Haiti rose up, defeated Napoleon's army. You know, in British history, British like to claim that they're the ones who defeated Napoleon. No. They defeated him after the Haitians had defeated him. They came after the Haitians had softened him up a little bit. So they did that and declared their freedom and their independence. And 1825, the country is celebrating its 21st anniversary of independence. And while they were celebrating the anniversary of independence, French and British and American warships surrounded the country. And they were told that if they want to keep their freedom, they have to pay reparations to the slave owners who had enslaved them. And they agreed. They had been locked out of world commerce for 21 years, and they agreed to pay the 150 million gold francs, which was calculated in 2001 as 21 billion US dollars. Aristide asked for the repayment of that money. That reparations broke and bankrupt the Haitian economy for 100 years. They were taking 80% of their foreign exchange earnings to pay that debt. There was no potential for development. And of course, the threat of invasion in the case of default. So, coming out of that history, I wanted to visit Mr. Aristide because he was the one who had triggered the conversation at the United Nations that there should be a conference to look at these kinds of injustices. It was an interesting moment in history because we were on the cusp, just the beginning of this long century. And we thought, well, in our idealism, how wonderful it would be if at the end of this century, there is global justice, there's global equality, reparations are recognized and repaid to all of these enslaved African peoples who are trying to overcome the legacy. So off we went in our idealism and arrived in Durban and found two circumstances. One, that there were two conferences taking place simultaneously. There was the Intergovernment Conference in one arena, and there was a civil society conference in an adjacent arena. In the intergovernment arena, there was a division between the Caribbean countries and the African countries. And that division was deep, because when the resolution for reparations was put on the agenda, the Western world and the European world said, if this item is adopted, we are leaving the conference. America had already left the conference on the grounds that reparations is an internal domestic matter and not for a global discourse. So they pulled out. Europe threatened to pull out if the matter was not removed. The Caribbean, we stood still. We said, no, we are representing the diaspora and we are here for justice. We are the ones who have gone through slavery for 300-400 years, and we are here to discuss this matter. The African governments did not agree with us, and they voted with the European Union to take the matter off the agenda. That's fine. So we went next door in the other conference, the Civil Society Conference, and there was 100% solidarity with the Caribbean. Because in the civil society were the academics, the trade unions, the students, the churches, the grassroots organizations. So the African people endorsed the reparations, and the African governments did not. But as historians, we knew this was not the first time that governments and their people see the same issue through different eyes. We understood that, and we were very proud of the fact that the African people had stood with the Caribbean people and the diaspora, because with that support, we knew that we were on the right track. With the governments not supporting us, we figured, well, you know, that's what governments do. You give them time, and they will come around. Well, no big deal, they'll come around. So that is how things worked out. And one of my interesting moments was when President Mbeki requested to see me, and I met with an Ambassador Zuma. At the time, she was Foreign Affairs and in charge of the conference. I met with her, and that was an interesting meeting, because she told me, look in my eyes and read my eyes. Now, you would have to be a first-class ambassador to say to someone, you are going into a room where the power is, but you look in my eyes and you will know what to say. Well, I don't know if I read her eyes correctly or incorrectly. But what I can tell you is that when I said to the country's leadership, the people of the Caribbean cannot stand down at this time on this matter, and we rather have no conference than a bad conference. And I stood my ground. And as I was walking out the room, and you're talking about 3 a.m., huh? As I was walking out the room, I saw a smile in her face, and I don't know what the smile represented, but we all know the subtlety of these matters. But we stood our ground. When we returned to the Caribbean, the heads of governments of CARICOM asked if I could prepare a briefing on what actually transpired. There was a moment of emotional intensity, because the CARICOM community could not have imagined that there could be space between the Caribbean, and South Africa. Nobody could imagine that there could be the slightest space between us, because the Caribbean people felt so proud of the role they had played as intellectuals, as writers. Bob Marley's beautiful music that inspired not only the Zimbabwe freedom fighters, but also the ANC. We had mobilized our culture to support democracy and justice in this country. And when those Cuban Caribbean soldiers came into Southern Africa to push colonization into the past, those airplanes used to refuel in Guyana and Barbados on the way to Africa. So there was this deep and fundamental integration. So that was a difficult one to explain, but as I said, we were comforted by the fact that right across this country and right across Africa, the masses of people understood, and we were embraced in this country and in Africa for taking the stance that we took. After the governments were given the briefing, they decided that what needs to be done now is to establish a commission, a Caribbean commission, to provide the evidentiary basis of the reparatory justice movement. So the CARICOM governments came on board with civil society and created a united platform to push for global reparatory justice. And it was recognized that the number one priority for the next decade was to use our advocacy, our diplomacy, to bring the African governments on board. That was our strategic target for a decade, to get the African governments to join with the CARICOM governments to take this matter into the United Nations and create a Pan-African solidarity for justice. Many of us traveled the length and breadth of Africa, giving lectures like this one, speaking at universities and civil societies across Africa, thanking the grassroots and the masses of people for their solidarity, but urging the governments to change their position. And that is what eventually happened 2 years ago in Accra. In Accra, the African Union said from here on in, Africa and the Caribbean and the diaspora will be speaking with one voice on this matter. It was a seismic moment. It was transformative. It was, one could say, the result of a 300-year journey. Because this moment, in which I'm honored to be playing a part, this is the 5th iteration of the reparations movement. You know, we live in a time and we hear the word now, and it means something to us. But this was the 5th wave, because it was rising and falling and rising and falling for all of these centuries. When the emancipation legislation was going through the British Parliament, the enslaved people said, we want reparatory justice. What is slavery? One of the one of the letters that was written to Parliament by the enslaved said, what is slavery? Slavery is to take away a person's labor. Every human being, they said, is entitled to enjoy the fruits of their labor. Our labor has been taken from us, and we have been denied the right to the fruit of our labor. Therefore, we want compensation. That was discussed in the British Parliament. That was the first phase of this movement. The British Parliament told them to hush and be quiet and to recognize that the emancipation you're getting, that is your reparations. So take it and move on. That was the 1830s. Each generation since then had been calling for reparatory justice. So each time I go on the platform to speak about it, I realize that I'm probably the eighth generation of Africans in the Caribbean who has been calling for this. So it's a long movement. The question is, now that Africa and the Caribbean and the diaspora have come to one voice, will this now bring closure? We have seen in Europe some very interesting developments. The universities that were involved in slavery, that received the endowments, that were buying and selling slaves to improve their financial balance sheets and all of that, and all of the prominent European universities were all involved. You know, that is why I went to Hull University in the first place, because when William Wilberforce was fighting for the abolition of slavery, he was the MP for Hull. And Hull University was built on his legacy. And so I went to Hull to be a part of the Wilberforce legacy. He died in 1833, but his legacy remained strong. And I was particularly upset when, to mark the bicentenary of the abolition of the slave trade, the British government gave my alma mater a tremendous amount of money to establish a research institute on slavery. And it was called the Wilberforce Institute for the Study of Slavery and Emancipation. And the acronym is WISE, W-I-S-E. We were at Downing Street and the Prime Minister's residence when we were having a reception to thank the government for this initiative. I was asked to give some closing remarks. And I said, well, how much better it would have been if the institute was called the Wilberforce Institute for the Study of Slavery, Emancipation, and Reparations, in which case the acronym would be WISER. They were not going to contemplate that at the time, but since then, just this morning I read in the news that Edinburgh has now apologized for their role as a slave trader and slavery, and they will work out a reparatory justice program. 7 or 8 years ago, I signed an MOU with the University of Glasgow that was deeply embedded in slave trading and slavery. And they agreed one of the consequences of entrapment on sugar plantations that you would eat what you grow. And if 90% of the land on an island is dedicated to growing sugar, then you eat sugar. And we ate sugar as a meal. Most people in the world would eat sugar as a sweetener. For us, we eat it as a meal. And which is why 70% of all the adults in Barbados today have diabetes. It's Barbados that was the home of slavery, the first slavery society, slave code, slave majority, is now known as the amputation capital of the world. Barbados has more amputations per capita among black folks than any other country in the world, and those amputations are the result of complications from diabetes. So this history is interactive. Now we are trying to manage this pandemic of diabetes that has ripped through the black population of the Caribbean. The fact is that the Africans in the Caribbean are addicted to sugar. And addiction is a hell of a thing. It's not easy to tell people stop doing it. It's a very complicated process of weaning millions of people off this sugar that they know is destroying them, but they cannot help themselves because it's been 300 years. So all of these conversations between the medics, the historians, the psychologists, all of these things are taking place. I mean, Glasgow University became the university of the slave owners in the Caribbean. The Caribbean slave owners, they want their sons, not their daughters, they want their sons to have an education. Where did they go? Glasgow. Glasgow offered them special concessions on tuition fees and all kinds of things, and the slave owners gave massive endowments to Glasgow. So the circle has now embraced all of us. And we do believe in this movement that this is not only about justice for African peoples who've been subject to the greatest crime in the history of humanity. 50 million people caught up in this terrible slave trade. You either die on the coast of Africa, you die on the trek from the interior down to the coast, or you die on the ships. You know, and those universities in the Western world, they all wanted to have great medical faculties. But the Pope had said that you could not do pathology, internal analysis of Christian bodies. They were not allowed to do that anatomy that they wanted to do on Christian bodies. So you had a choice. We all watched those Frankenstein movies, right? Where they went and dug up people's bodies from the graveyard and took them to the laboratories to see how the human body worked. But there was a better choice. When the Africans died in the Middle Passage, rather than throw the bodies into the ocean that were consumed by the sharks, because after 200-300 years, the sharks had figured this out. That is a source of protein in the Atlantic as a result of all of these bodies every year being thrown into the water. So the sharks had adjusted their environmental survival strategy to follow the slave ships. And we have the narrative of the ship captains who speak about these creatures following the ships. So you got the bodies, wrapped them in salt, wrapped them in cotton, and off they went to the universities where they could examine them and see how the human body is really structured. A lot of that research was done on the bodies of enslaved Africans who died in the Middle Passage or on the plantations. So science as we know it today, and we all benefit from this scientific research, but a lot of it is rooted in access to the bodies of our ancestors, because that was allowed. So this is not only a moral discourse about right and wrong. The Archbishop of Canterbury, the head of the British Anglican Church, came out to my university, the University of the West Indies, a few months ago. He apologized on behalf of the Anglican Church globally. We gave him an honorary degree for his reparatory justice theology. He left us in the Caribbean, went back to England, and his church threw him out as Archbishop because of the position he took on this matter. So a lot of sacrifices are being made all around. I am certainly hoping that they wouldn't fire me, because if they do, I don't think I will be employable in my own country. So I'm hoping that they won't. So, it's a complex matter. It's not only about justice for African people. This is about changing the trajectory of the world. It's about changing the trajectory of the world. When I see every day that genocide in Gaza, when I see those children starving to death in those communities, people being bombed in their little homes, murdered in their beds, when I see those circumstances, they bring back memories of the Caribbean model. The Caribbean model was, if 15 Africans revolted on a plantation, if they revolted on a plantation and killed maybe 1 or 2 white people in that revolt, the slave owners would then massacre 1,000 people before they were satisfied that they have uprooted every possible imaginary source of a rebellious consciousness. So they would scour 50 or 60 plantations in the whole neighborhood, and they would massacre 1,000 people in response. So when I see that Caribbean experience and I see what is going on in Gaza, I said, well, these people must be reading Caribbean history, because it is so familiar. One moment in history gives an example to another people in another moment of history, and thus violence and oppression are reproduced in a way that we would much prefer humanity to be healing, because this is about the healing of humanity, because racism and racial policies that are predicated on one's color, one's religion, one's ethnicity, that is primitive human behavior. And I would like to imagine that if this movement achieves one objective somewhere along the trajectory of this century, it would be that humans will learn to respect each other's diversity and dignity. And if that could be an objective, then I believe universities have an important role to play in that regard. We cannot bury our heads in the sand and say, well, these conversations are outside of the walls of our academy. They're not. They're not. So I thank you for the generosity of your attention. Vice Chancellor, I thank you for inviting me out here. And I should tell you, as I was walking to the podium, I did say to myself, when you were my guest 2 years ago in Jamaica, I should have made you deliver the public lecture and in the same old way. So let me say, I owe you reparations. Thank you all very much. Thank you.
Fortunately, I only have to deal with the questions and answers because I will not know how to respond to that wonderful, wonderful lecture. Sir Hilary, it was so much to make us think again. And this question about why humans are so cruel to each other and to itself, I don't know why we can't answer that. Yeah, so as you can hear, I am short-breathed because it was really an amazing lecture. But as I say, fortunately, I only have to deal with the questions and answers because there's so much to say and ask. Colleagues, we only have 15 minutes for the questions and answers, so I am going to ask you to keep your questions brief. Please don't make a speech yourselves. Keep your questions brief. I'm going to allow one question per person, and if there's time left, I will give you a second opportunity. So, hands. I am sure there are many comments and questions. I see Prof. Yolandi.
Thank you very much. I'm in the privileged position where I had exactly the same conversation with my father about studying philosophy, but nevertheless, I managed to make a living out of being a philosopher. My question regards the issue of reparations, but in a sense looking forward. I think we are in a strangely privileged position to be able to benefit from looking forward and seeing cases where social injustices, environmental injustices are happening right now. So my question to Sir Hilary is, how do we take the lessons that we have learned from the past and injustices of the past and reparation justice of the past and apply it to, I'm thinking especially here about the Gaza genocide, but even something like environmental justice, where it's perhaps less immediate but still urgent. How do we apply those lessons to deal with those crises today?
Thanks, Prof. Yolandi.
Thank you. I think this is also where universities have a critical role to play. Excuse me. We need to ensure that the evidentiary basis of the victory, institutions, and practical governance, so that a generation that fought will see their own kids assuming that these things are common sense. It's how to move the impossible to common sense. And the only way I can think of that is through popular culture and formal education. If that does not take place, then the risk of reversal is real. And a revolution is really an important reform that becomes irreversible. That is the key. So how to make it irreversible? And one of the strategies, as you have said, is to interlock all aspects of that struggle so that all kinds of people could participate. Reparatory justice for women. In my university at the moment, 75% of our students are female. We've never had a female vice chancellor. In the grassroots, 68% of the unemployed poor are women. So there's that dimension. There's the dimension around religion. I mean, the whole idea of taking life over philosophical beliefs of creativity and creation might seem to be madness to some of us, but these are real issues. The climate change, the countries that were colonized and exploited are the countries that are in the vanguard of climate change devastation. So you might say we have jumped out of colonization, slavery, apartheid, and now we've jumped into the frying pan of climate change, as if there is clearly an interrelation. Whenever a hurricane comes through the Caribbean, the chances are that it's the very poor people who are going to be wiped off the face of the earth. The rich people, mostly the white people, they built their houses of stone and they built them on the hills and they built them in a way that is intergenerational. The poor people build their little wooden houses in the valleys, on the slopes of mountains and hills. And when the rain comes before the hurricane, before the wind strikes, it's the water. It's 5, 6 days of persistent water. The mudslides and those houses are washed down off the slopes. The people in the valley, the water destroy their houses and they're washed into the sea to their death. So the connection between hurricanes and history, very clear. The same people who suffered the history are those who are in the vanguard of dying during the hurricanes. So, rising sea levels. We have seen in the Caribbean as small islands every day the impact of climate change. Rising sea levels. We see that. Beaches that we used to play on no longer exist because the ocean has taken back the beach. And we see this every day. The impact of that is rural fishing villages where people have been making a living as fisher folk. The fish has migrated because the water is getting warmer and warmer. And the fish move out of those zones, go looking for places to spawn, but traditional breeding grounds have been destroyed because temperatures are rising. So the interlocking nature of this devastation need to be understood, and as I said, it needs to be brought into education, curriculum, policy, constitutional reform, and governance. Until we can do all of that, achievements can be reversed. Thank you.
Thanks. Lucinda, do you see?
Good evening, Sir Beckles. Thank you for a very wonderful presentation. It's great to see someone here speak so frankly about these important issues. Early on in your presentation, you mentioned 3 things: reparatory justice, climate change, and something along the lines of genocidal warfare, and the importance of an academic project of trying to theorize and pull all of these things together. In contemporary discourse around both of these things, I mean, the kinds of inequality that characterize the problem and the climate challenge, there's 2 words that jump out at me. The one is Giorgio Agamben's sort of insistence that the camp, as in the death camp, is the paradigmatic form of modernity. And the second is Crutzen's Anthropocene. And listening to you speak, I'm struck by sort of huge blind spots potentially within both of these concepts, and wanted to test with you Donna Haraway's suggestion that instead of talking about the Anthropocene, we should be talking about the Plantationocene, because it's not humans in general that have produced the climate and the inequality catastrophes that characterize us at the moment. And she goes on to argue that the plantation is in fact the paradigmatic figure for thinking about modernity. And so my question to you is, thinking alongside ideas like the Anthropocene, ideas like the camp, as Agamben uses it, what significant additions into that discursive space would just naming and claiming the plantation as that form bring into the discourse that might currently be missing?
This is why I drew reference in the early part of the analysis to why I chose to study oppressed working class white people as my doctorate research. Because you are always in danger of using broad statements about entire groups of people. Now, the reason why I agree the plantation is the source is because it is the plantation of the Caribbean and then later on the Americas, because it moved out. It was so successful an economic model, it migrated across all of America. This was where human beings were classified for the first time in human history as non-human. The plantation produced that paradigm. These African people, from here on in, will be property, chattel, real estate. Buy them, sell them, lease them, mortgage them, treat them as currency, do anything with them that a market could understand. Now, where did that idea come from? This was the incipient rise of capitalism. This was 17th century capitalism emerging out of medieval Europe and looking for total control over labor. And it was a minority of people. It wasn't all the English or all the Europeans, because when this was happening, there was opposition in England and in Europe. There were people in England who were saying, this is wrong, this is evil, this is unchristian, this is sinful. And there was a tremendous pushback against that in Britain and in Europe. But how did that popular resistance meet its fate? Because those investors who were into profit maximization at all costs, and who said, we have pushed white labor as far as we can push it, but now we must hold back. But now we need Africans to allow us to cross over the frontier and to define people as non-humans. And how did they win that battle? They won that battle by saying to the British people, do not mind these resistors. Slavery is in the national interest. Anytime someone tells you that something's in the national interest, run for cover. Run, run. Those capitalist investors convinced the British people, give us the freedom. Give us the freedom to enslave the Africans because it is in the national interest. Now, why did they stop it? It took them 200 years to realize that that thing that was in the national interest is destroying the soul of their country. The famous statement, what do you think of English civilization? And the answer is, well, I didn't know they had one. You know, it is how humans can buckle under the analysis of an interest group. And that interest group is able to convince an entire nation that my interest is in your interest. And people go along with that up to a point. You'll probably know that story that Beth and I do. We all had it in primary school. Alice in Wonderland. That conversation between Alice and Humpty Dumpty about what a word mean and whatever. And I think it was Humpty Dumpty who said, a word mean what I want it to mean, no more and no less. And my meaning, I will make my meaning your common sense. So it's how you migrate minority interests into majority consciousness and get their compliance. But I do believe that the point is that the plantation, that extraordinary construction, you have to understand the enormity of this thing. An Englishman leaves, or European leaves, go to the Caribbean, buys 200 acres of land, goes to Africa and brings 500 Africans across an ocean, an eight-week voyage in chains across an ocean, bring them onto your 200 acres, produce a commodity called sugar, take that sugar, export that sugar to the world, and make a fortune. Any individual who could pull that off, and you're speaking about some of the smartest people in the world at the time, and they were able to pull off that enterprise, a global institution, using European capital, European management, African labor, a commodity the world wants, and then you sell it to whoever wants to buy it and make a fortune. And that was the beginning of international capitalism, and it started right there in the Caribbean with this plantation slavery malarkey. Thank you.
I'm going to Lucinda, allow one more question there in the back in the corner.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much, Prof, for your interesting lecture. My name is Dr. Muteo Koitsiwi. I'm the director of the Indigenous Knowledge System Center in the Faculty of Natural and Agricultural Sciences based in Mafike. First of all, let me thank also the Vice Chancellor and also you, Prof, for signing the MOU with the Northwest University and the University of the West Indies. I think from us also, Prof, as the IKS Center, we are interested in such kind of collaborations. And I think I also know about Dr. Jalani in the University of West Indies. Would like to engage with also such kind of people because I know he's also running the Rastafari Studies program, and I've seen you've been with the university since the 1970s. Probably you have those institutional memories. And secondly, when you were talking about repatriation and how you came from your humble beginnings with your radical approach towards politics, I was wondering why you never mentioned Leonard Percival Howell, who is also the founder of the Rastafari movement in Jamaica, because he was also very radical, also about repatriation, and also Marcus Garvey, who is also one of the greatest Pan-Africanist and nationalists coming from Jamaica. And there's also a lot of literature around issues of repatriation. But I also want to know, how does the University of West Indies deals with the memorialization and to preserve the legacy of such kind of people who were also very influential with regard to the history of Jamaica. I'm very glad you also talked about the influence of reggae in the liberation of Africa as a whole. And also thank you, Prof. Dumi, for also mentioning about Professor Falola, who also made a presenting lecture on the like previously in the university, and he also spoke about indigenous knowledge system, how we can use that. Unfortunately, I was not part of that lecture, but I also got the remarks around that. Prof. Bismarck and Professor Modise and Professor Midupi, they made a mistake when they were visiting the University of West Indies and they left me behind. Maybe I will find an opportunity to go there in 2026. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for that intervention. It got very personal there. As a teenager, all of us, my friends and I, all of the teenage black boys, we all had the choice. We could grow afros or we could grow dreadlocks. I opted to grow an afro and had one of the largest afros in Great Britain. But my friends who grew dreadlocks, as we got older, all the afros went bald and the dreadlocks have remained. So clearly I made the incorrect decision. But on a more serious note, when I made a statement that the first generation of enslaved people who were emancipated called for reparations, and we are, I think I describe this as the seventh wave of it. Of course, Marcus Garvey is associated with the third wave and the Rastafarian movement with the fourth wave of this. And the Rastafarian movement is extremely important to global and Caribbean history, especially in the context of this conversation, because the Rastafarians took a decision in the 1930s when they opted to fight against the Italian invasion of Italy in the defense of Haile Selassie and to protect the Ethiopian nation from falling into colonization. That was an act of historic bravery and dimensions. But critically, they were the ones who said, listen, we African people are stolen people. We are stolen people. And under international law, we have a right to be returned from the place from where we were stolen. And for 100 years, the Rastafarians have taken that position that there are stolen people and must be returned or given the choice to return from whence they were stolen. That was putting your stake in the ground of history because they have not moved. And that is the basis why we have now arrived back in Addis. Why we're going to Addis in November to litigate how we are going to proceed from here on in. And at the center of that is the Rastafari. We are all going to go down to Shashamani and visit the Rastafarian settlement down there, the lands that were given to the Rastafari by Haile Selassie and others. So there is that bridge. So Pan-Africanism is built on a grassroots and intellectual and theological infrastructure laid down by the Rastafarian community. And in the University of the West Indies, we take this very seriously. We have all kinds of Rastafarian studies. We have Maroon studies. We have indigenous people studies. And we have just launched a study, a center for the study of Maroonage and genocide. When I say that Barbados was the center of this beginning, how did it begin? It began with the English invaders of Barbados. They arrived there in 1627, and they wrote a letter back to, I think it was King James I, and said, Your Majesty, we have arrived at a place the Portuguese called Barbudos. and we have surveyed the island, and there are no people here. It's an empty island, perfectly suited for our enterprise. No people, but there are houses everywhere. How do you have an empty island with houses everywhere? Because it's a flat island, no mountains to do the maroon, and the Spanish would raid Barbados and capture the indigenous people and take them to Mexico to work in the mines. The Portuguese would raid Barbados, capture the local people, and take them to Brazil to work on the latifundia, on the plantations. So within 50 years, the island was denuded of its entire indigenous population. So the English were able to start this sugar culture with no internal resistance, a flat, empty island. But it began with genocide. An entire people wiped off the land that they had inherited for 7,000 years. They had been living there. All gone. All gone. So yes, these moments in history, they have very important lessons for us today. The forcefulness of the consequences of those kinds of decisions are resonating with us right now. As a teacher, I will tell you, occasionally I'm invited to go to primary schools to talk to kids, little kids, about these matters, history. The last school I attended, a bunch of 10-year-olds, and they were quizzing me about how far Mars is away from Earth, how long does it take sunlight to leave the sun and get to Earth, how many light years travel would it take to get to Jupiter. And these kids are all into space studies. Now, it is a bit freaky to be talking to kids about history, and all they really want to discuss is astrophysics, right? Because they are fascinated by this notion of intergalactic movement and history, and are they going to be going to the moon before they die, and will there, how many more years do Earth has? How many more years do the sun before it explodes? And fortunately, because I'm a sci-fi freak, I was able to answer them. And I spent an hour and a half with 10-year-old kids speaking about astrophysics when I went there to talk about slavery. But, you know, the Center for Maroon Studies is because all of us in America, all the African people in America are Maroons. Every chance we got, we ran away. Every chance we got, we off the plantation into the forest, off the plantation up the mountains, off the plantations, jump on the boat, sail to the next island. I'm writing a paper at the moment about an African, his name is Jupiter, and he disappeared from his plantation. An advertisement is put in the newspaper, Jupiter missing. Igbo, facial scars on the left cheek, black, all the descriptions of runaway Jupiter. And he is spotted in St. Vincent, which is about 2 hours sailing time on a canoe from Barbados. So they go after him there, then he disappears again, he goes to Dominica. Then he disappears again, and he's wanted dead or alive in all of these places. Then he is spotted in St. Croix, which is now part of the Virgin Islands. So they tracked this man down for 18 months, and then one morning, the plantation owner heard a noise in the plantation village. So he grabs his musket and he goes down to see what the hell is going on. And he goes down in the slave quarter, and who does he find? Jupiter. Jupiter has returned after 18 months on the seas, on the high seas. So he got 21 lashes with the cat o' nine tails, all his back scarred up, salt and pepper in the wound. Then he's put into a dungeon for 2 weeks, no light, and fed just water. And they took him out the dungeon, and then they asked him, by the way, why did you come back? He said, well, I was free. But what is freedom to me without my wife and children? So I've come back to support my family. That is where it begins, and that is where it ends. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think we would really want to go on and on and on listening to all your wisdom and your stories, Sir Hilary. Thank you so much. But our conversations made me think about a quote that I like to use of Gandhi, and I hope I'm quoting it correctly here, saying that humanity is all about being humane. So, the question remains, why is being inhumane so embedded in humanity these days? And I think it's our responsibility as academics to give voice to all this inhumanity. Thank you so much. I'm going to invite our High Commissioner, Prof. Dumini.
Thank you so much, Prof. Mirna, and thanks once again, Professor Sir Hilary. I think let's give him another round of applause. Highly stimulating lecture that leaves us with challenges in terms of pursuing some of the issues that you raise. We talk about narratives, historical narratives, and I think in our context, we get so many different but sometimes very airbrushed, sanitized narratives about the history of our experience of colonialism, apartheid, of slavery indeed. So I think it's a challenge to historians in our midst to pursue further engagement and do further research in pursuit of the truth and in pursuit of justice, and also to join the movement for reparations. Thank you so much, Sir Hilary. With that, I would like to now invite the Jamaican High Commissioner to South Africa, again, Mrs. Joanne Thomas Edwards, to give a few reflections on the CARICOM Africa collaborations. Ms. Edwards, please.
Mr. Vice-Chancellor, Professor Thorbeka, and the Master of Ceremonies, Professor Dumi Moyo, I just want to thank you, first of all, for inviting the CARICOM High Commissioners and Heads of Mission to this event, and for inviting an esteemed son of the soil, of the Caribbean soil, Professor Beckles. So I join in welcoming him as well. I'm joined here by my colleague from Guyana, His Excellency Forbes July. There are four of us here in South Africa who represent the Caribbean, and that's the Ambassador of Haiti, Trinidad and Tobago, Jamaica, and Guyana. So we are all here in support of Professor Beckles. We all know his scholarship, and we were just so honored to have him here in South Africa with us. Now, I'm not going to speak for very long. I'll just highlight a few points, because the worst thing is to stand between yourselves and dinner. I see that they're ready to serve dinner, so I will not stand between yourself and dinner. Now, you've heard Prof. Beckles speak about CARICOM, and I'm not going to make the assumption that everybody knows about CARICOM. We are 15 member states, all the member states within the region. We have a grouping called the Caribbean Community, which is called CARICOM for short. And Prof has very expertly highlighted the whole history of the link between the region and Africa, how we came into being, and how we became the Caribbean, part of the sixth region, the African diaspora. So the question is, how can we strengthen that partnership between Caribbean and Africa? And this is part of our remit here as ambassadors and heads of mission, to strengthen that link. We, as you have heard from Prof, we are committed to working side by side with the African Union to ensure that the partnerships, that we deepen our relationships between ourselves and the region of Africa. It has been a work in progress, as he has clearly outlined. It's something that is incremental, gone in different waves, but we're still on a path to deepen that relations. And he mentioned historically the 2001 conference, but even more recently, I just wanted to highlight a few things that have taken place at the governmental level to bring the two regions together. I remember clearly in 2004 when President Mbeki came to Jamaica and we had the ministerial meeting, the African diaspora meeting with him. There's one thing about former President Mbeki was very, very passionate about bringing the African diaspora together. And we saw there are some ebbs and flows. It's somehow since 2006, thereabouts, 2007, there wasn't much momentum. But in 2021, we saw a new lease on life between the African and Caribbean regions. There was a summit in 2021 where Caribbean leaders once again and the African region committed to strengthen that relationship. And out of that, we had different processes. I'll mention a few things. There's the 7th of September, which is really known as Africa-Caribbean Day. I don't know how many people knew that, but it is African-Caribbean Day celebrated. And it was one of the decisions out of the 2021 summit. We also had a commitment by Afrexim Bank to strengthen the investment aspect of the region, where we seek to invest in the African region and vice versa. And the Afrexim Bank has gained a lot of traction, and most countries in the region have signed the MOU to ensure that this partnership works. So that's just one thing that I wanted to mention there. So how can we, as the Caribbean diaspora, unite fully with the African region? And I just want to highlight a few things, a few areas where we can work in some practical ways. As Prof mentioned, we have the spirit of survival within us, that spirit of tenacity. We, as a people, we have gone through a lot, and we have developed our own systems and things that we can share with the world. My brother there spoke about Jamaica and in terms of the retentions, African retentions, the Rastafarian movement, and other things. And this is a gift that we can share with the world. So I speak about, one, the cultural cooperation. There are synergies between the Caribbean region and Africa. We are similar in terms of our people. We look like each other. And it's something we need to build on. So cultural cooperation is something that is a can-do, it's a low-hanging fruit. So one of the things we'd want to see in terms of collaboration is more cultural exchanges between the region and Africa. Educational exchanges. Now, I'm going to step on Professor Moyer's toe because we had a discussion on this some time ago. Education is one area where we can share our best practices. We can learn from each other. But sadly, in my experience here, I find that there is little knowledge about each other. Sad to say, we're all birds of a feather, but somehow we do not flock together. Something needs to change. We need to change the narrative about that. The Caribbean region, we need to know more about Africa. There's a lot of scholarship that come from the 6th region. Academic work. There's Prof. Beckles, who is our shining star. But when I've gone around to different universities to ask them, do you have anything, any kind of literature, any kind of academic work on Caribbean writers or so? The answer is no. I wanted to get some books in to some of the different universities to see if we could encourage that kind of exchange at that level. Oh, we don't offer it on our curriculum, so therefore we're not going to buy the books. So things like that need to change. So these are low-hanging fruits. So sports. The continent is a sporting continent. We have so much in common. The Caribbean region, we are known for our sporting excellence. We can have exchanges. Tourism, the people-to-people contact. We need to know each other more. But one of the challenges that we do not have direct air transport between the region and Africa. A few years ago, there have been some charters. Out of Nigeria, I know a charter went to Jamaica and also to Barbados, and I think there have been few, but we need to have more. Why is it that we still have the traditional trading routes in terms of how we trade with each other or we move among each other? So these are things that can change. I mentioned the cultural exchange already, and trade. Need for increased trade among each other because there's so much we have in common, so much we can learn from each other, so much we can buy from each other. Well, Marcus Garvey was one of the first advocates of, trading with Africa. He was sabotaged, as the history will tell you, but it's still something that is live in our consciousness. And these are some areas. So I just wanted to leave those areas as food for thought in terms of how we can collaborate between the Caribbean region and the African region. So I just wanted to throw those few points out in support of what Prof. Beckles had said. We need to take this relationship forward in tangible ways, and these are some of the tangible ways, in addition to reparations, with which we can achieve that. So I thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Edwards, for those very insightful remarks. I can assure you that a seed has been sown between our two institutions and by extension between our two regions. And I'm sure something is in the making. There's already quite a number of collaborative initiatives between ourselves and the University of the West Indies, for a start. So thank you so much for that. It's now my honor to call upon our Senior Deputy Vice Chancellor for Teaching and Learning, Professor Linda du Plessis, to give us closing remarks. Professor du Plessis.
Thank you, Prof. Dumi, for giving me the last word. But I think it's a privilege to close what has been a truly inspiring and thought-provoking evening. On behalf of the Northwest University, Sir Hilary, our gratitude to you for a powerful and timely lecture from Durban to Accra, the rise of the global reparations movement, and more so the way in which you shared your personal journey, which has a history of social injustice, but also is testimony of surviving injustice and living a purposeful life. Now, Sir Hilary, in his CV, is a distinguished academic, an international thought leader, a global public activist. But Sir Hilary, I think you can add to the list, you are a brilliant storyteller. I mean, when you shared the narratives of Jupiter and the slaves and the sharks, I think we all have these vivid images that come to mind. You don't even need a PowerPoint. And this reminds me of a book that I read by Mrs. Gaskell. And she said, loyalty and obedience to wisdom and justice are fine, but it is still finer to defy arbitrary power unjustly and cruelly used, not on behalf of ourselves, but on behalf of others more helpless. So your conversation challenges us, I think, to reflect, to remember, and to act. And we are privileged to host you this evening, and we look forward to tomorrow with great pride to honoring you formally with the conferring of your honorary doctorate. Your leadership and scholarship will, I hope, continue to shape global conversations. And I think, Prof. Bismarck, we are proud to say that Sir Hilary is now one of us. And with us, I mean the Northwest University community. To Prof. Dumi, thank you for facilitating the evening, but also thank you to you and your faculty and Dr. Goodrich for initiating the process of nominating Sir Hilary for this honorary award. Prof. Myrna, thank you for facilitating the question and answer session. Ms. Joan Thomas-Edwards, the High Commissioner, thank you for your uplifting words and your support in the spirit of collaboration. And we are reminded of the importance and potential of stronger CARICOM Africa partnerships. And I think I speak on behalf of the university that we would like to be part of this unfolding story. And of course, to all our guests online, colleagues here, students, members of the Diplomatic Corps, and friends, thank you for joining us. Your presence reaffirms our shared commitment to knowledge, justice, and transformation. Finally, I have to thank the team behind the scenes, the organizers, the marimba band when we entered, and all of you who work seamlessly and professionally so that this evening is a success. Let us carry this momentum forward as we do at the Northwest University. And with that said, I think High Commissioner standing between me and opening the bottles of wine is my closing, so I'll make it quick. Thank you and enjoy the rest of the evening.